Helena Sheehan in conversation with Zeyad Nabolsy and Jordan Whelchel. Now, before introducing our speakers, I want to note that the CTW is accepting applications for its summer school, which is held over the course of 3 weeks in July, both online and in Paris. Now, getting on to our participants today, it is a great pleasure to introduce them. I'll start with Helena Sheehan, who is an author and an academic activist. She's emeritus professor at Dublin City University and visiting professor at Peking University. Western Marxist geographically, but not ideologically. She is active on social media. She has published several articles and given lectures on all major continents. She has published several books, among which I would like to highlight Marxism and the Philosophy of Science, Navigating the Zeitgeist, and Until We Fall. Zeyad Nabolsy is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at York University. He has published on Marxist history and philosophy of science, German classical philosophy, and the history of African philosophy. And Jordan Whelchel is a PhD candidate at Villanova University who's writing a dissertation on Friedrich Engels and the dialectics of nature. With that, I'll turn it over to Helena.
Thank you very much to Critical Theory Workshop for organizing this and for thinking this topic was important and for thinking I had something to say about it. On this topic of Marxism and science, how to approach it, how to summarize in 20 minutes an area that's been occupying me for decades and about which I've written hundreds of thousands of words at this stage. Having spoken about this topic so many times in so many decades, each time I have to find a fresh relationship to it and not be stale. Of course, times move on, and there are always fresh problems and challenges in presenting this in a new time. So I've always found a way to do that. I think, speak, and write about other topics. And sometimes when I'm really concentrating on something else, I also write about culture, although I'm not exactly what you call a cultural Marxist. It's a different thing with Marxists analyzing culture. But anyway, I write about other things. And I keep getting called back to this. But I've never stopped thinking about it and addressing it and being interested in it and trying to think about its relevance to the present, whenever that is. When I'm thinking about how to approach this at any given time, I try to reconnect with my initial way into the topic and try to convey something about that to those that haven't taken this path, what my initial enthusiasm was, what my sense of discovery was about it as I found my way into it. So to retrace my steps just really briefly here. In the 1970s, I was active on the left. I was new left before I was old left. But by the 1970s, I'd become a Marxist. And I was exploring the different areas of Marxism and setting out really to make this tradition fully my own. Whatever I do, I tend to do in a big way. So there was a debate going on at the time in the pages of Marxism Today, which is the journal, which was the journal of the CPGB, about the dialectics of nature. But it was also happening in other publications and in other gatherings of the left. And there were various books about it at the time. And a lot of it was going on and on about dialectics and kettles boiling and, water and ice and steam and all of this. But there were also allegations about the Marx-Engels relationship, the Comintern debate about Lukács and history and class consciousness. And there were references to earlier generations of Marxists. Now, this was the kind of debate that later Terry Eagleton characterized as kettles boil, classes struggle, and Lukács recants, which was, sort of amusing. But it nevertheless was a very serious debate. I followed through in all the different angles to it. And I was fascinated both by the philosophical arguments and also by the political drama of it. I just found everything about it really interesting. So this mushroomed into a gigantic book. As I say, whatever I do, I tend to do in a big way. This is the first edition of it. And it's been through 3 editions now, and it's had a very long shelf life. I mean, there's hardly a day when I get an email from somebody, when I don't get an email from somebody who's just reading it. It's my first book, and it's probably been read by more people than all of my subsequent books put together, which makes me wonder, have I developed at all? But I think I have. So in this book, I outlined various debates, and there were many converging debates. In these debates, I was committed to trying to convey all sides fairly, but also taking strong positions on the various debates that I was conveying. So against the tide at this time, I stood out against the accusation that Engels had distorted or even betrayed Marx, and insisted there was a basic harmony between them on questions relating to philosophy, nature, and science. I also held, again against the tide, that Lukács had been sincere in his recantation against the dominant preference for the earlier Lukács and the disavowal of his more mature positions. So another way that I was in opposition to the prevailing atmosphere at the time, even on the left, was in my attitude to the previous generation of Marxists. I was really fascinated by J.D. Bernal, J.B.S. Haldane, Joseph Needham, and others who were not only internationally eminent scientists, but had a philosophical depth and breadth of vision that I came to respect and even revere. Also, astonishing to me, really astonishing, was the discovery of Christopher Caldwell, who was not an eminent academic. In fact, he had never been to university. He was an autodidact who had the most breathtaking grasp of the whole range of knowledge of his time, and also a creative take on all of it. And his work actually only became known after he died in the Spanish Civil War. But my own generation, in the pages of New Left Review and elsewhere, even Marxism Today, took a dismissive and even a condescending view of them, which set me on the warpath against this position. So, and also these other positions which were prominent on the left at the time, Western Marxism, they came to be called. They also were tied to divergent positions on the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries, as well as about the core position of class and class analysis and the mode of production. And I became involved in all of these debates. But the one on philosophy and science was the one I concentrated on in doing my own writing. But I was involved in the whole nest of debates at this time in the 1970s. And feeling, very much isolated in terms of, obviously I was isolated from, mainstream academe. I was at Trinity College, Dublin at the time, but also sort of against the position of a lot of the fashionable left of academe at the time. I was in the Communist Party, however, and that was something of a counterbalance to it. I set out in this book to tell a big story about the relationship between science, philosophy, and politics as it played out in the various debates between, both between Marxists and also between Marxists and other intellectual positions, and to do this over a period of decades. So I explored the philosophical arguments, but I also paid much attention to the rich historical context in which they played out, because it was high drama, I discovered the more I got into it. And sometimes there was even blood on the ground. And after the book was published, I was pleased when one reviewer said that it read like a novel, And another said that he turned the pages as if it was a thriller. Now, that's not something a lot of philosophers would consider to be a compliment, but I thought it was. I was really delighted that people had this reaction to it, because it is a powerful story. And to just give some desiccated account of the philosophical arguments without all of the flow of history from which it came would be a distortion of it. So I did this, I wrote it this way, not just to somehow make it more interesting or more publishable. I did it because I thought it was essential. And in all my writing and teaching, I do my best to reconnect thought to the socio-historical context of human thinking. And sometimes I do a bit of what I'm doing now, even retrace my own personal processes. I'm doing so. But so much philosophical writing is just so abstracted, so distant from the flow of experience, giving rise to real philosophy, that I feel it actually distorts it. So I feel that there's even less excuse for doing this when it's Marxist, because we're the ones who are supposed to understand how ideas are shaped by socio-historical, political, economic processes. So I tried to capture the concrete texture and the dramatic pulse of this history in writing the book. I later even went back and wrote the story about writing the book, which was also very dramatic in its way, especially the times I spent researching it in the Soviet Union, exploring a society where my worldview is in power, unlike where I lived and worked for the rest of my life, where it was so marginalized. And I was really fascinated by the debates that had taken place in the early days of Soviet power in the 1920s, when everything was debated. All these questions I was dealing with about science and philosophy were being dealt with, but everything was being debated, and mostly among the Bolsheviks themselves. What was the nature of a Soviet society? How do, industrialization, agriculture, the future of the family, free love, everything, absolutely everything was being debated. And so that was a lot of my agenda, what I was researching when I went to the Soviet Union. So I started talking about this and asking questions about it. And then the people I was asking about it began to ask me about it because they didn't know about this history. So I found all kinds of interesting things every day when I woke up in my institute. I had this sense of adventure. I tried to. I was trying to understand Soviet society as well as my immediate research agenda. So in doing this, I didn't shy away from the problems and the contradictions, because there are problems about, I was really happy to see my worldview in power, but there are problems about a worldview being the ideology of one party state. And that created a lot of problems over the years in the Soviet Union. And a lot of historical, it was tied in with a lot of the historical tragedy. And the historical tragedy was bearing directly on the history I was exploring. And I was sometimes really shaken by what I found and what I had to write, especially when it came to the purges and how they played out in academic debates, but also in the whole society. I found myself very immersed in that in a way that was really quite disturbing. So here too, I found myself in opposition to people around me from opposite directions, from three directions really. From mainstream academe that didn't think any of this was really, nearly as important as I thought it was. From the left wing of academe, Western Marxism, that had this different attitudes to the Soviet Union, and actually both mainstream academe and Western Marxism, anything that I had to say, which was, disturbing, they saw as ammunition to dismiss the intellectual seriousness of the debates and to undermine the Soviet Union. And then as now, I argued that in looking at the Soviet Union, there's more to defend than to denounce. But I believed that I could defend the Soviet Union more effectively and the importance of these debates more effectively by doing it honestly and by admitting the problems and the contradictions. And then this set me against the Communist Party of Ireland, where I was a member, where, you know, their attitude to the Soviet Union was you just didn't question anything. So to everybody else, I was very pro-Soviet, but then the party I was called anti-Soviet just because I, you know, spoke honestly about the Soviet Union, even though I felt I was speaking positively about the Soviet Union. Anyway, I also wrote two autobiographical volumes where I talked about all of these forces in my own time and all the intellectual debates in which I've participated and the concrete flow of movements and ideas and events, because I felt it was important to bear witness to them in this very vivid way that I felt that I could. So in writing this, back to my first book on Marxism and Science, there were many philosophical issues. You know, there were a whole cluster of philosophical issues. A lot of them were debates about, you know, particular sciences. In biology, there was a huge debate about, you know, Lysenkoism, but then that was part of a bigger debate about genetics and evolution, about heredity and environment. There's a whole debate about quantum physics and, you know, all of this. So all of these debates are in the book. But underneath all of these debates, I think that there are two sets of major philosophical issues at stake in these debates. One is, and I think this is the big issue: is Marxism a comprehensive worldview, or is it only a socio-political economic theory? And many who call themselves Marxists assert that it's a distortion of Marx and Marxism to say it's a comprehensive worldview. And the whole controversy about the Marx-Engels relationship is primarily about this. But underneath this, there are even more primary questions, which were on the agenda in my times. And that is it necessary to have a comprehensive worldview? Is it even possible to have a comprehensive worldview? And this is the thread running through all of my work. I believe that much of contemporary intellectual life has a hollowness at its core. There's a sense that it's ungrounded and it's unmoored, that, you know, people are just flailing about because most people, but even most intellectuals, have not worked out a fundamental worldview. And I don't think you can really have anything very deep and important to say without having it grounded in a comprehensive worldview. I feel really strongly about this. And even as a child, of course, Catholicism nurtured this. And I was at a big loss, you know, when I lost that. And I didn't just take Marxism off the shelf either. But I just, you know, can't imagine going through one day without having a comprehensive worldview, although I went through a long period where I was seeking to reconstruct one. But to me, you know, it's just so primary, so basic. But evidently, you know, a lot of my contemporaries all these years don't feel that way. But I think this is something really at the core of what is wrong with contemporary intellectual life. So the second big issue is epistemological. And that runs through a lot of this whole cluster of debates as well. Now, science studies, even from what wasn't called science studies, but even from the time of Marx and Engels, but, you know, particularly in more recent decades, it's been rent by a tension between science as empirical investigation and science as social construction. And this big emphasis on science as social construction has given rise to, you know, the anti-science studies, which has become so strong in that discipline. And this played out most dramatically in the science wars of the 1990s, and it was crystallized in the so-called hoax versus social text. But the whole thing about the 90s and the science wars debate, much of it proceeded as if Marxism had never happened. I was infuriated about this because Marxism from the beginning was in advance of any of the positions that were taken in that discussion. Because Marxism from the beginning has been a synthesis affirming both the cognitive validity of science as knowledge grounded in empirical investigation, and it also affirmed the integral connection of science to economy, culture, philosophy, and virtually everything. And so, yes, science is socially constructed, but it's also reliable knowledge of nature. So I believe that the epistemology of mainstream Marxism is what I would call a critical realism. I don't mean Roy Bhaskar. I really resent the way this has been branded to Roy Bhaskar, because this is there in mainstream Marxism, whether he ever wrote anything or not. I don't particularly like his writings, to be honest. But basically, the point of critical realism is that we can't know the world apart from our knowing of it, but we really can know the world as it reveals itself in our knowing of it. So knowledge is a relationship. It's a relational term, knowledge, between the knower and the known. And it's not only the individual knower, but it's a whole socio-historical process of knowledge production. So, of course, we need demarcation criteria. Positivism was right about this, and to raise this in the really sharp way that it did. We need ways to differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate claims to knowledge, basically by experience, empirical investigation, and logical reasoning. Yes, it can be complicated, but we have developed from the whole history of philosophy and from attention to ongoing science and the experience of our times, a sound philosophical position. And we as Marxists do not fall into epistemological nihilism because of this. It's a rich, strong tradition that has worked through all these problems, unlike neopositivism, postmodernism, and also like much of Western Marxism. So there have been a growing number of intellectuals and activists. I mean, in the years I've been involved in this, somebody just pointed out to me recently that the first edition of my book came out 40 years ago. So, that I was working on it for, a decade before that. So, I've seen a lot of rising and falling in terms of this whole agenda. Of course, the fall of the socialist societies of Eastern Europe in the late 80s and early 90s was, a real low point in this tradition, because, a lot of the in Eastern Europe, there were a lot of scientists that were into thinking philosophically about science. There was a really strong, rich tradition of this. And a lot of them lost their jobs. Most of them lost their jobs, as a matter of fact. Their institutions were abolished or taken over. And so in many ways, that was a low point in this whole tradition. But I've seen it rise and fall in response to various things. And I think there's a kind of rise of it going on now. I think the pandemic was a factor, but I think that the whole ecological crisis is a very big force in raising this tradition to the contemporary agenda again. And I think there are a growing number of intellectuals and activists bringing this tradition to bear on the pressing problems of our time, such as ecology. And of course, John Bellamy Foster and Monthly Review have played a leading role in this over an extended period of time now. And as some of you, I think, know, there's a very big conference on Marxism and ecology in Venice next week. And there are many presentations over 4 days with multiple parallel sessions showing a very, very strong engagement with this topic about Marxism and ecology. So I'm presenting at this, and I've called my presentation "Science and Synthesis: Does Late Capitalism Constrain the systemic thinking that's required by ecology?" And I want to raise the following questions. Does ecology demand a comprehensive worldview? Is the ecological crisis exacerbated by the lack of systemic thinking? How does the prevailing social division of labor shape the production of knowledge? Is unity of science a meaningful goal? Can it be achieved without a grounding in an integral philosophy? And what is the role of political economy in this scenario? And finally, is Marxism the answer to these questions? And I guess you know how I would answer all of these questions, particularly the last. Yes, I think Marxism is the answer to these questions. And I want to argue that the production of knowledge is shaped by the mode of production of everything. And that thinking about, actually, I've been thinking a lot for a while about the relationship between philosophy and capitalism. But not just philosophy as a separate discipline, but philosophy, a theory generally, and intellectual production generally. What is the relationship of this to capitalism, and what's been the trajectory of this from early capitalism until now? And I think that the bourgeoisie, as a rising class, took philosophy very seriously. I think in the early days of capital accumulation, in this struggle to break free from the fetters of feudalism, to make the world safe for science and commerce, they needed philosophy in their quest for hegemony. First of all, to explain their agenda to themselves, and also to make their case to others. And I think that the intellectual dimension of their struggle for power in the early stages brought forth the epistemologies of rationalism and empiricism, the ontologies of new forms of materialism and idealism, political philosophies of liberalism and conservatism in response to that liberalism. And I think that these theories, from epistemology and ontology to politics, economics, and law, were underpinned by a radical individualism and pluralism, which has led to increasing fragmentation. And science, even the natural sciences, moved in a parallel development of specialization in the direction of atomism and further fragmentation, subdisciplines of subdisciplines of subdisciplines. And raising the problem of who sees, how does it all add up? Who knows, what an overview of this would be. So all of these intellectual disciplines have been subsequently rent by contradictions that could not be resolved within the system bringing them forth. And I think even in the 1930s, Caudwell was arguing that with the degeneration of capitalism, its radius of cognition has tended to diminish. And I think this is even more true in our own times. And I think that philosophy, unlike the early days of capitalism, I think philosophy has lost its place in the scheme of things. And I'd like those of you who are in philosophy departments maybe to address this, if you might. But I think that what survives, I mean, there still are philosophy departments, but by the way, a lot of universities don't even have philosophy departments anymore. But I think what survives in a lot of these places that do have philosophy departments, are kind of this and that. It's become increasingly fragmented, and some of it's even become unhinged. And I think this is because capitalist intellectual culture tends to fly off in all directions, chasing one myopic version of reality after another, from the plodding particularity of positivism to the deconstructionist exotica of postmodernism. But I think as different as they are, that both positivism and postmodernism renounce overarching worldviews and grand narratives. But even, see, when I was younger, there were big debates about these things. And I mean, there are all kinds of, philosophical isms, but really, basically, there are different forms of positivism, neo-positivism, postmodernism, and Marxism. I think these are the three, philosophical positions that have faced off against each other in my time. But I think now they exist in kind of what I would call degenerate forms. Hardly anybody even names positivism or postmodernism anymore. I mean, most scientists are kind of implicit positivists in their laboratory, but they've never embraced. They couldn't even tell you what positivism is as an ism. But also in the humanities and the social sciences, I think a lot of this is true. But see, when I was younger, yeah, I'm talking about the 60s, the 70s, even into the 80s. There were these vigorous and passionate debates in universities, at conferences, in journals, and on the left itself. There was a big clash of contending paradigms, and it's kind of gone silent at this level without anything really having been solved. And I mean, there's just this kind of, discontinuity and randomness and fragmentation, and ultimately it's meaninglessness and powerlessness. And some even they just accept and affirm contradictions, and they disavow any push to resolve them. I mean, the other day on Irish radio, I was listening to this Irish novelist, Colin McCann. He's a very good novelist. I've read several of his novels, and I'll read the new one. And he's a very thoughtful person. But he said that, what you have to do is to learn how to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. And I heard another person on radio quoting F. Scott Fitzgerald saying, this is a definition of an intellectual, an intelligent person. You can hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. I say, no. The thing about facing contradictions is to push to resolve them, to push through contradictions to synthesis. I mean, you can't resolve the contradictory problem in the external in the world out there itself, because they're contending forces. But you, as an intellectual, you have to think this through. You just can't think two contradictory thoughts and just leave them there contradicting each other. But I think a lot of contemporary intellectual life is like this, because people can't see their way through this impasse. And so they tend to produce just this wallowing in the contradiction, or a leaky eclecticism, or some, less than satisfactory resolution. And it just skates along the surface of phenomenon, and it never breaks through to the core patterns of interconnection. It never breaks through to the shape of the whole. And I think of philosophers, of all people, we should be looking for the shape of the whole. That's our role, not just writing articles about articles about other articles about other articles, about philosophers writing things that, nobody who's not a professional philosopher will care about anyway. Or some people just, they abandon the struggle, and there's a kind of renunciation of all isms in a lot of contemporary life. But I think that we have to analyze this and see that capitalism is a system that systemically obstructs systemic thinking. And it masks the realities of itself as a system. And I think only a philosophy with a critique of capitalism can break through this and generate a coherent vision. And so the necessity of engaging in this totalizing thinking goes against the detotalizing pressures of capitalism, and gives us a real difficult task as Marxists. But this is precisely why we're needed. Because capitalism not only creates and intensifies economic injustices and political corruption, it also poisons nature, it poisons culture, education, and everyday life. I think capitalism colonizes not only economies and governments, it colonizes schools, universities, mass media, social media, it colonizes psyches. And so I think that the centralizing market decentralizes the psyche. It organizes production and consumption, but it disorganizes community. Um, Capitalism, especially as it plays out in universities, it requires ever greater specificity of outcomes without criticism, reflection, or integration. And so, this is the central paradox of our times, that never has there been such a totalizing system as contemporary global capitalism, and yet never has there been such inhibition of systemic thinking. And so it's never been so challenging to pursue this kind of totalizing agenda because of the detotalizing pressures of the age being so strong. But I think that there is nevertheless this seeking of truth, this striving for justice, that this system can neither satisfy nor suppress. And it's our job as Marxists to nurture that. I think that we're experiencing a widespread crisis of meaning, a crisis of purpose, a crisis of mental health, which I think is basically a crisis in worldview. And we have to bring our tradition, our analysis, and our movement to bear upon that.
Thank you very much, Helena. Now we're going to hear from Zeyad.
Thank you very much, Helena. I mean, I'm really honored to be here because your work has had a tremendous influence on me. I guess I'm going to be taking up some of the strands and maybe some questions that Helena posed, and maybe I'll do so from actually the perspective of Marxism in the global South and specifically Marxism on the African continent. I mean, this is my area of one of my areas of specialization. And it's really interesting because if you think about, kind of the most prominent uh, Marxists on the African continent during this, let's say, wave of independence movements around the mid-20th century. You think of people like Amilcar Cabral, for instance. They had a very different attitude towards the relationship between Marxism and science than the attitude that one finds in Western Marxism. Or actually, so for people who maybe aren't familiar with the expression Western Marxism, I think it's also a bit equivalent, functionally equivalent to the way that the term critical theory works in at least North America, a little bit in some departments. And there, I mean, you see people like Cabral, who's an agricultural engineer, and who obviously experiences and understands that there is a kind of social determination or social construction aspect to science. So he sees very clearly how the colonial agenda to create a cash crop economy is functioning in Guinea-Bissau. He tours the countryside, talks to peasants and so on. And yet, he still has an understanding, of course, that one could make a distinction between good science and bad science, or science that makes well-warranted claims and discourse that pretends to be science but maybe does not make well-warranted claims. So there is a perspective that, of course, there is social determination or social construction involved, but science could still have emancipatory potential. And actually, I would say this was actually, interestingly, maybe the orthodox position amongst a lot of African Marxists. And it's quite interesting because they, of course, have had to reflect on the history of things like race science and the use of race science to justify certain relations of domination and so on. But also, when you look at the history of African responses to race science, even as back as the 19th century, mid 19th century, you see African scientists trained in anatomy and physiology, like James Africanus Beale Horton, who essentially undertake this kind of immanent or internal critique of the works of race scientists, prominent race scientists in the 19th century. Uh, some of them actually were involved in the materialism debates in the 19th century, so maybe Jordan will get to them, like Karl Vogt, actually. So I think there is also this, it's incumbent upon us to actually take the history of science quite seriously and see how we could develop a kind of historical materialist model of the history of science that takes these social factors seriously, but also that isn't just saying that social determination is equivalent to a debunking of the epistemic claims of science. It's also quite interesting that Helena posed some of these questions about the unity of science, the relationship between philosophy and science. Um, and I find it quite interesting that the reception of Marxism, at least in the second half of the 20th century, in North American Anglophone departments, so these are the ones I'm kind of maybe familiar with in a professional sense, has involved an assimilation of Marxism to what people also call continental philosophy. Uh, but interestingly, it seems to me historically, at least, these questions about the unity of science, the relationship between philosophy and science, the extent to which philosophy should be a kind of theory of science, um, were really carried out in a kind of current of modernist philosophy in the late 19th, early 20th century. And you do have, I think, different groupings there. So you could think of Marxism as one current, you could think of positivism as another current, and you could think of also cross-fertilization. So Otto Neurath, kind of the left wing of the Vienna Circle. So I think that's also a really interesting thing having to do with the reception of Marxism in Anglophone philosophy departments in North America. Um, I mean, there is also this question of, so for example, to take a concrete example which shows how I think Marxist thinking can be quite fruitful for issues that are debated today. One key issue that's, the subject of debate on the African continent amongst, scientists, philosophers, social scientists, has to do, of course, with the relationship between modern science and colonialism. So some people have claimed that modern science is inextricably bound with colonialism. Um, Other people, including Marxist philosophers like Paulin Hontonji, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about him and his theory of science because I think he kind of applies historical materialism uh, to this question to actually show that far from colonialism acting as a kind of social system for the imposition of modern science on African societies, specifically West African societies in this case, it was actually a system meant to thwart Africans from coming into serious contact with modern science as a set of theoretical practices. Um, and here again, you see that there is this question of social determination, but taken up in a quite nuanced way. And actually, what I think, sorry, I can rant a little bit about Hontonji just because I have a forthcoming book on Hontonji and historical materialism and theories of science. But one really interesting thing about Paulin Hontonji as well, to take him as an example, is he also takes some historical materialist theories of science, so such as Boris Hessen's account of the early modern scientific revolution, and asks, well, how could we modify such theories to take into consideration the history of colonialism on the African continent? So if you have a kind of Hessen-Grossman account, the account of early modern science developed by Henrik Grossman and Boris Hessen, And then you also have a lot of Marxist writing, of course, on colonialism. You have different competing versions. You have, of course, dependency theory, and he tries to create this synthesis. So, on the question of synthesis, which Helena brought up, having a coherent worldview, I think this is an interesting example of that. Uh, but I also want to raise some questions as well. So one question, I think, on the question of having a comprehensive worldview, ought we have a comprehensive worldview? I mean, on a personal level, I find Elena's advocacy for a coherent, comprehensive worldview quite appealing. But I'm also thinking, well, there is this question of uh, the incredible fragmentation and internal differentiation of modern societies, creating these fissures at the intellectual level. And there's the question of how do you deal with that at the level of politics, where you do need some kind of agreement. So it might seem quite difficult to develop political coalitions if one requires that one has to adopt a kind of comprehensive worldview wholesale. So I think, while I'm like Helena suspicious of eclecticism, but I also understand there might be a kind of pragmatic political motivation to say, well, look, regardless of your views on the history of early modern science, if you agree to certain political and social positions, this is sufficient for us to take you on board a political or social movement. Uh, and the other question was with respect to pluralism. So, thinking about the relationship between Marxist approaches to history and philosophy of science and contemporary currents in history and philosophy of science, sociology of science as well, of course. There is a question, for example, of whether there is something that we can refer to as the scientific method. So there's this question of, does a Marxist view on history and philosophy of science entail the commitment to the existence of a single scientific method? Uh, or could this be jettisoned, or this commitment be modified somehow? Um, and actually, on just on that note of pluralism, I want to maybe bring a kind of more sociology of knowledge perspective. Again, taking up the African case study, where you see this very strong, I would say, current um, in science and technology studies focused on the African continent, where the claim now, one of the central claims, is actually there is a distinctive African way of knowing that could substitute for the modern sciences, so that one doesn't need to worry about problems in the institutionalization of modern science on the African continent. And you see this current actually becomes quite strong in the 1980s, but I think we also have to think, historically about this, where you see actually the 1980s, what's happening in the 1980s is the imposition of structural adjustment programs on various African countries, which entailed, among other things, the defunding of universities, the defunding of research centers. And one worry I've always had about this kind of current, which maybe hides behind the language of pluralism, or even going so far as to speak of epistemic relativism, is that it's a way to redescribe defeat as a kind of victory, to say, well, we had these projects from, the Bandung period up to the 1980s, which aimed at institutionalizing basic research in various fields, of course, agriculture, but also in physics and chemistry. These institutions were defunded, and it just so happens in the 1980s we also discovered that we don't really need them after all. So I've always been, suspicious of this kind of ideological function. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that. Pass it on to Jordan, of course, Constanza, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Zeyad. Yeah, Jordan, the floor is yours.
Well, I was actually going to see if we wanted to give Helena a chance to respond to Zeyad's points, and then I could jump in. I mean, I guess initially I would say I totally agree with what you said earlier, Zeyad, about this sort of the intricacies of political coalition building and how, in my own personal experience, being fully committed to a kind of Marxist materialism philosophically, when in my capacity as a political operator, have found that that's often the first thing that needs to get compromised, that, comprehensive worldview. And so I have a suspicion, given certain things you said, Helena, that you probably agree to some extent with that kind of needing to parse out political versus philosophical contradictions. But I wanted to maybe hear your responses to that, and if you want to respond to other stuff they had said, and then I'd be happy to go after.
Yeah, I think we have to be coherent within ourselves. I think that, as intellectuals, as thinkers, as teachers, we have to have a comprehensive worldview for doing our own thinking and writing. But I think as political activists, both, in academia and outside it, I've been politically active both in and outside of academia. I think we have to go for broad coalitions. I can't think we can, build the kind of left that we need to build by having some kind of, philosophical orthodoxy that everybody has to agree with every nuance of what we individually, coherently have arrived at. I think we need to persuade people if we, of our view, we feel strongly about it. I think my idea of how the left should build would be to have broad left parties, but platforms within them. And even within those platforms, you can't have an orthodoxy of every single nuance of a position that you might, insist on for yourself. And I think that has to be by persuasion, and not, hitting people over the head, sort of reciting, I mean, I've seen, I've been in a party where dialectical materialism was like the Catholic catechism of my youth. And we can't do that. But for a while I saw the kind of thing that I think, was a model, and it crashed and burned, but not because the model was wrong in this sense. I was very involved with Syriza in Greece. And it had platforms from all of the different, traditions of the left. There was a separate and strong communist party in Greece, but there are also people that came from a more critical, but sound communist tradition that were the strongest force when I first came to know it, and people from Maoist and Trotskyist positions, and people that come from a kind of new, new social movements and, Occupy movement background and all of this. And there's certain things that are, the basis for agreement, a certain critique of, the crisis in Greek society, and, and a critique of capitalism for that matter. But then, people have their traditions within that, and their arguments about various things. And I think that is the way that the left should go. I tried to, I was involved in trying to organize a similar thing on the Irish left, and it's too complicated to go into now, but we have a kind of broad formation where all of the platforms come from Trotskyist backgrounds, and then other people are just broadly left. But I think, I agree with where both of you are going about that we have to, and also I think that, we have to, all my life, I've acted politically with people who were religious. They were not materialist. They shared a critique of capitalism, or at least they were against the Vietnam War. I first became active there in Philadelphia, where there was a very strong Quaker left tradition. And also there was a very strong Catholic left, which was very militant at that time. And I had left religion behind me by then, but I found that important and meaningful and correct to act in broad movements with those people. So I think we're in agreement about that. But at the level of our own intellectual development, and and what we try to persuade people to believe as teachers, I think we have to be comprehensive and coherent, and to just kind of give up on that. And so there are different levels to that. I also, while I'm at it, I just want to say that I'm glad Zeyad brought the whole dimension of African philosophy into it. I've actually given this a lot of attention. I'm not going to go on about it now, but I think there are a whole nest of interesting interlocking debates there. And the one you specifically raised about scientific method, I think there are levels and levels to that. At the level of the laboratory, there are certain empirical procedures and reasoning things that I think are universal. But what Marxists bring to bear on that is the whole, the wider context and the whole shaping of the agenda, what questions are pursued, what experiments are done, what the larger consequence of all this is. And there's a lot of, reasons to be skeptical about the whole, agenda of big pharma as it bears on our universities. I think there are a lot of problems with, the African ways of knowing and the ice people and the sun people. I've done a lot of reading about African philosophy and Afrocentrism. And I think a lot of it is very problematic, but there are real issues involved there. But I don't want to be talking too much, Jordan. We want to hear what you have to say.
All right, fair enough. Okay, well, thank you so much, Helen. And I want to also repeat what Zeyad and Constanza and everyone has already said about what a pleasure it is to be talking to you. I mean, likewise, your work has been a big influence on me trying to research Frederick Engels, the dialectics of nature, and to try to tell a sort of contextualist history, which is also a philosophy. You get a lot of pushback because people say, well, are you doing intellectual history or are you doing philosophy? And, I was for sure touched by your comment that our own psyches can sometimes be colonized by capital, because that sort of way of thinking started to weigh heavily on me. And a friend of mine, good friend of mine, kind of snapped me out of it by saying, surely the role and relevance of history in forms of explanation and in philosophy has to be non-negotiable, right? If we're approaching this as Marxists. And that was sort of like splashing cold water on my face. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm ready. We're back. And I also wanted to say a funny thing that my girlfriend was like, oh, wait, so you're doing that event with that person who wrote that pink book you were carrying around for like a year? So just to say, but anyway, on this point of the fragmentation of knowledge, I mean, I think that that's a really interesting point that you raised. So I guess to give a bit of perspective on how I'm approaching the problem, I got interested in Marxism through also a kind of Western Marxist, the way it tends to come down through universities, but then almost immediately took that into party organizing. I was like convinced Marxism had to be correct. I joined a party and I've been in a party ever since. And so my development has been on those parallel tracks and have been dealing with that tension um, the whole time. Um, but my research now is on the kind of history around the very origins of dialectical materialism, the work of the late Engels that became dialectics of nature, and trying to understand um, from a kind of historical, sociological, scientific, political, and philosophical level, sort of synoptically, all those levels combined, like what was the relevance of something like debates over materialism, for example, and what was the significance of worldview at that time? Because you certainly did see prominent scientists in, for example, like the GDNA, the in English, it's the Association of German Natural Scientists and Physicians, amongst themselves debating whether science is or has a worldview, or whether it's a kind of pragmatic, basically skeptical investigation of the natural world, where skepticism or positivism could equally be said to be the spontaneous philosophy of practicing scientists. And then materialism was put forward on the one hand as a methodological postulate, right? Well, we just have to assume there can be no supernatural causes in the things that we're exploring as chemists, physicians, whatever. Beyond that, think whatever you want, right? Or materialism as a wholesale worldview, which could replace traditional religious, political worldviews, other kinds of holistic or totalizing worldviews that had existed before that. But it does seem like fragmentation kind of did win the day, because reading these historical debates now, and how materialism was debated in the 1850s or 60s versus reading someone like David Chalmers kind of talking about materialism from a philosophy of mind position nowadays. He just, when he sets aside materialism reluctantly as a way of explaining what the mind is, he's like, okay, well, if materialism just means explaining everything in terms of basically physical causes as the ground level of explanation, maybe that doesn't work for consciousness. But it's not to reinforce a religious worldview. It's not to, I don't know, become an apologist of sort of bourgeois notions of natural law or anything like that. It's just sort of a casual statement that has almost no electric charge to it at all, it seems like. And so I've been thinking about this a lot, and wondering whether one of the theses of Engels from Dialectics of Nature that might unfortunately be not correct is that there's a spontaneous drift that, he was anticipating science is going to have to become more and more dialectical, more and more materialist as it advances if it's going to be able to continue making real discoveries, continue actually like unfolding the nature of nature. If we want to make progress in science, it's going to just converge automatically on a dialectical materialist kind of worldview, whether or not it ever admits it. So I wonder if what you were saying in terms of the fragmentation of knowledge sort of speaks to the falsehood of that thesis of that kind of prognostication. Um, I was also interested to hear you kind of talk about philosophy and raise, I thought, some really insightful questions about the status of philosophy now. Because when I was thinking about, to the extent that there is a revival of interest in kind of Marxist understandings of science, Marxist understandings of nature, what are the sources of that? And at one point in an article you shared with us beforehand, you mentioned how Kan Kangal, who's kind of a forerunner of mine writing about Engels and dialectics of nature, says it has something to do with anti-communism kind of wearing off. We're far enough away from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Um, and for a period of time, people stopped freaking out about socialism, communism. Bernie Sanders repopularizes socialism in the United States, and it just changes the ideological climate where we can start to reopen these discussions. So this seems to be kind of the argument. And I think that that's correct as far as it goes. You point to ecology, and I think that's also obviously correct. But then I was going to ask actually whether you agreed that part of the interest for this revival might just be the ongoing identity crisis within philosophy that it almost hasn't stopped having since the 1850s. And so we've seen sort of trends emerge, new materialism, object-oriented ontology, deconstruction, and things like that, some of which are more long-lasting and change the terrain, um, maybe not permanently, but you know, for a while, and others of which seem to kind of burn out within a few years. Um, and so I wonder, are there dynamics internal to philosophy so we could sort of look externally at the sort of political economic climate, but then also look internally, things within philosophy that might be pointing to the need to go back to a tradition that got submerged quite a long time ago, whether that was with Engels or with people that you like to mention, Bernal, Caudwell. I mean, for me, one of the people that really sparked my interest was Maurice Cornforth. And so anyhow, yeah, I guess because you then turned that question on me before I got a chance to answer it to you, and you wanted to know what those of us in philosophy departments had to say about it. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. Um, it does seem like the classic projects have kind of all imploded. Continental philosophy, I mean, at Villanova, one really gets a sense where continental philosophy could be a project because people had to fight to make it acceptable in universities in the United States, right? And so building SPEP was a project, building continental departments in universities was a project, and that was really enough to keep people going for a while. Then I do think, early on, before we all got jaded about the utopian possibilities of the internet, cyber thinking, going back to cybernetics and reading Deleuze in light of cybernetics, that was very fashionable in the 90s. And then a lot of the people doing that turned into, basically neo-Nazis. And So yeah, now we do seem to be kind of at a loss for a project, but then when I think about materialism as a baseline, I read people like Peter Godfrey Smith and I think, oh my God, maybe Engels was right after all. Some natural scientists are becoming dialectical materialists without knowing it. And maybe it is worthwhile reviving this project. So I guess if I could pass it back to you with a question, like, do you think is it a worthwhile thing for us to really continue trying to, I guess, reconstruct what is in some sense, many sources are quite old, like Engels and the Dialectics of Nature, Christopher Caldwell, these sources are quite old, but they were passed by. And so I wonder if efforts at reconstruction or retrieval would be at the top of your agenda, or whether, as I think you said at one point, we need to be more, I guess, present-minded. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. I think that it's never that there's an unbroken line there. Is there from Engels until us talking right here, right now? I mean, there's never been a time when it was completely forgotten and laid aside. And even when, when I said I was fighting against, this trend and that trend, I mean, there were other people there. And some of them were in communist parties and a lot of them in, Eastern European countries. And, there is an unbroken line from Marx and Engels and until now. I mean, there's been a rising and falling in popularity and how many people were taking notice. But this is a kind of unbroken line of tradition. So I don't think so much as reviving it as carrying it on. Yes, there's a tension between the historical and I think our primary task as Marxists is to analyze the contemporary conjuncture. But I'm also into the history of this whole tradition. I'm proud to have written that book. I feel that in arguing about now, I'm carrying forward this, and sometimes I have to go back and acknowledge that when I'm standing on the shoulders of these giants, and they form the way I think about the present. So I think that, but on the other hand, I think that, there's and I noticed this in China, there are all these schools of Marxism, and they're a very good thing. There are a lot of these young people, a lot of young people studying Marxism in a very scholarly, serious way and in a committed way. But there's just a lot of detailed Marxology. I was constantly, what about Marx in 1859 and Marx in, then in 1862, and I don't know that all that off the top of my head anymore. But and also there's so many doing PhD. I don't know how many PhDs are being done on Marx's PhD. And I think that, it's the whole, I think that we have to, I think the problem about naming an intellectual tradition after one man, great as Marx was, I prefer if it were called something else, but I didn't get to, none of us now get to decide that. People are constantly saying Marx when I want to say Marxism. It's a whole long intellectual tradition, and Marx was one person. And I think there are places where this is obsession with every little historical detail, and then and also I've noticed a thing that I'm very opposed to, the kind of textism. I get these articles to review, and they're just texts about texts about texts, and when this is about Marxism and Marxism text, there's no excuse for that. Marxism is not just texts about texts about texts. I think that the starting point, the constant touchstone, and the end point always has to be the world and analyzing the contemporary conjuncture, but also, seeing that there's a thread of history there that we're bringing forward and analyzing that conjuncture. The whole question about, convergence, the Engels saying that natural science, would naturally lead in the direction of dialectical materialism. Bernal strongly argued that as a scientist. And I've seen in my whole life, scientists that, that did think that. I think that they're countervailing tendencies. I think that capitalism itself, as a whole system, is degenerating, and it's a force for the degeneration of virtually everything. There's the kind of unraveling, but there are people pushing against that, and I think that a lot of the people involved in ecology are naturally thinking more systemically. A lot of the problems, is that too many people involved in ecology don't. I mean, I got up at a political meeting and asked a, Green Party candidate a question, about systemic and about capitalism and systemic analysis, and he started talking to me about retrofitting and cycle lanes, and a lot of the Green parties have, been defeated in recent elections, not only here, but in the European Parliament. But I don't think it's because of our left critique, unfortunately. I think they've been defeated for the opposite reasons. But I think that people who do get seriously involved in ecology and really feel, the weight of this great crisis, and this fear of the future that comes with that, are naturally, pushed to think systemically about it. And I think that there are people that are open to our persuasion to develop that further. But I think that there always have been scientists who have been more philosophically inclined, and a lot of them that have actually developed this tradition within Marxism, not just the famous ones like Bernal, but an awful lot of ones that I've known in my life, have come to it through science and thinking through the problems of science. I mean, people like Bernal and Haldane really did come to it directly from thinking philosophically about science and then, discovering Marxism. And Haldane talks about this kind of, or a viewer of Haldane talks about this kind of open sesame, thing that and I had this feeling where I had a lot of the pieces of Marxism in place before I was actually a Marxist. And then the sense that, okay, I still didn't have every piece of the puzzle put together, but I knew where I was going. When you're at a puzzle, well, I haven't done one in light years, but, where you kind of see, where all the pieces are going to fit, even though you don't, you've kind of got it, it's kind of like that. But I think that the world's in a very bad state. There's confusion, there's fragmentation, and our job is to not be confused, and to push against the fragmentation. And I mean, there's a lot of teenage suicide, that I think is lack of meaning. This is a big area that I want to get into, the whole crisis of worldview and its ramifications in all aspects of contemporary culture. And I want to do it vividly. I mean, I just gave a talk about it in January, and I just read some passages from contemporary novels, that just reflected this in a visceral way. And I think Marxism just has everything to offer. And, the world needs it, and it needs us to make the case for it.
So there's a question from the chat, from Sabir Hussain. How is science going to deal with AI? Is science in threat because of AI?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about AI, and I've been kind of using it on the side, not to do my work for me, but just to see how it would deal with certain things. It's actually, in some ways, I mean, there are a lot of problems about it. In some ways, it gives good summaries of a whole range of knowledge. I've been asking it really big questions, and it summarizes, a lot of studies and then the different points of view. Um, and but there's a problem of de-skilling and people just using it to do their work for them and not thinking themselves. And of course, as university teachers, there's a huge problem about academic integrity. Um, and yeah. And suddenly you start to get papers written in perfect English, that you never even got before from native English speakers. Um, I think there are just so many levels of problems, but I think Marxism has to analyze this in the same way that we analyze everything. We have to see, what it's like as a practice in universities and in all kinds of jobs. We have to look at the whole political economy of it, the whole discussion of it around the time that China produced DeepSeek and all of this. Yeah, I mean, a lot of Marxists and a lot of them more expert than me on the technology of it have been giving a lot of thought to it, and I can't sum it all up in just a few words. This is a big area where a lot of Marxists are doing a lot of serious thinking about it, and the kind of thing we need to think seriously about.
We have a final question coming from the chat from Colin Badale. Could you say more about some of the debates surrounding quantum physics in the history of Marxist science / USSR?
Oh, yeah. Well, I wrote about this a long time ago, and I haven't thought about it that much since. There's a recent book by Sean Winkler, I think, about Hessen and all of those debates that I think is very good about this. The thing is that the debate about quantum physics, it reached its sharpest at the point where there was a debate about everything. And in 1931, there was this huge transition in the USSR. Whereas there were all these debates, as I was mentioning, there were just all kinds of points of view in the field in the 1920s. And then in 1930, 1929, 1930, 1931, there was this kind of push to close down all of the debates. And this had to do also with the transition from the new economic policy to the first 5-year plan. And to decide there had to be the Marxist position on everything. And quantum physics got, caught in that. Although the most disastrous one was the debate about biology. But it's not a thing I could answer, quickly, just, off the top of my head like this. But, the whole way of interpreting these debates, has to be seen in the context of this whole swirl of interacting debates in the USSR. But the one in quantum physics wasn't nearly as sharp or as tragic as the one in biology.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, Helena. We can
And
wrap it
also
up
about
here.
that, there was a
Sorry.
tension. Sorry, there's an ongoing tension. I'm just trying to remember what I actually know about this. An ongoing tension between quantum physics and relativity, and there are all kinds of dubious interpretations of quantum physics that were, going on in the 1930s, especially around Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty and all that. But I think it's too complicated to go into in much detail now. I think we're out of time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the audience on YouTube. This was a really great pleasure, and we'll meet the next time. Bye.
Okay, great. I just cut the stream.